Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to see the extent of interest there is in a country that is going through such a difficult time, and that is bringing into these difficulties a great many other countries who are trying to help, including my country, Latvia. Tomorrow morning, I shall be addressing the opening session of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which takes place in Riga, Latvia. In 2007, Riga was, or 6 was it, was host to the NATO summit when, I think this is no military secret, one of the major points I made in my presentation as president of the host country was that the problem, the situation in Afghanistan will not possibly be solved by military means alone. And since at the time that was the great emphasis, I'm very pleased to see that since that time there has been considerable progress in understanding that it is a multidimensional intervention that is needed for obtaining some significant processes and progress in this country. From what I understand, Afghanistan has been tried to be invaded by any number of forces, and it has always managed to repel them. The willingness of the Afghans to collaborate with one or another invader has split the country, as always happens in such situations. And we just heard how the country is like so many countries on our planet, not a nation state which has been grown up over time on the basis of ethnic unity, of common religion, of common historical development and aims and values. Take the case, say, of Norway or of Denmark, countries which until very recently were very homogeneously in their ethnic composition and were very homogeneous in their religious beliefs and in their values. We just heard how diverse is this country, and we have also heard, and we all know, how varied the levels of intellectual development, levels of education, political attitudes, if any, and means of economic support are in that country. You do not have a country there where you could transfer willy-nilly any model of success developed somewhere else in the world. When my country, Latvia, recovered its independence after 50 years of foreign occupation and military occupation, it had something to look back on. It had the previous years of independence, and it had the previous centuries of surviving under various foreign oppressions, but with a unified Latvian spirit and a unified Latvian culture. And it is from those roots that in the 19th century, Latvia had a national awakening. That national awakening produced a great energy and a great desire to come together with what we have in common and to build a nation, and ultimately to demand that this nation also have its own state, because an independent state is the best way for a population to put in action all the aims and goals that they have to create a society that is to their image and not to somebody else's. And a nation state that is unified is also one that allows people to identify themselves with it. We talked about the European identity. And of course, the lack of a common European identity stems from what? From the fact that we have any number of actually very successful nation states that have managed that integration, that sense of I am a German, I am a Frenchman, I am a Brit, and I belong to that, and I'm proud of it. And even in countries like Great Britain, where the Scots, of course, were downtrodden and conquered, and many still remember the hideous Battle of Culloden and what followed, they do have now their parliament, and so does Wales. And this has allowed Great Britain to maintain its unity and its power in spite of losing all its colonies. It has managed to continue working and developing its democracy step by step. The democracy of Britain today is not the one that they had in the 30s, it's not the one they had in the 19th century. There have been substantial changes in that country. So if I were to be asked, what should we be looking forward to in Afghanistan? First of all, of course, to get peace in it and to stop military action. Yesterday we emphasized, and I certainly did, on the role of soft power and how important that is, and on diplomacy. But diplomacy will not work when your partner is not ready for dialogue, when the mindset and the whole sort of mental universe of your partner is from 500 years in the past, and they have a completely different picture of the world and how things work in it. When you have really this disconnect in basic values, concepts, and understanding, then, alas, things come to a military confrontation, and yes, then you do have to try and knock the other guy on the head before you can try and convince him of changing his ways. And that's what military action is about. And as I emphasized yesterday, you will remember, by no means, by emphasizing cultural diplomacy and the role of soft power, by no means do I want to denigrate the need for hard power and for such alliances as NATO. My country depends for protection, for collective protection from NATO. It does not, I am sorry to say, feel secure in that particular geographical place where it is situated, nor with that particular history that it has behind it. Central Asia is also not one of those neighborhoods where you can sort of sleep lightly and feel that everything is going to be okay. You never know what your neighbors are thinking. You do not know if they'll come in the middle of the night and slit your throat or burn your house. There are serious difficulties there. So the first step, of course, is to establish by military means some sort of space of security where civilians are not at risk. And for NATO and the current forces there, I think the big challenge is how to accomplish the fight with the Taliban without accumulating the number of civilian victims. I think every time a certain number of civilian victims are affected, you are losing the battle for the minds and the hearts of the people. It is necessary in a military sense. It is very harmful in a social sense. To compensate for that and to realize that these are sad offers to the fight for peace, I feel, and this is what I said some years ago at the NATO summit, we must, I think, put more effort into the civilian part of building up Afghanistan. The Afghan people, of course, and I'm glad of the presentations we heard, they are committed to it. They wish to do something about it, but the circumstances are so complex and so difficult around them that they do need help. But that help should not come willy-nilly. It should not be a matter of just showering millions and hundreds of millions on the head of the government, the actual probity of which is often put into question. There should be an effort across the board to attack civil society, if you like, the problems in it in a variety of ways. Health problems and the provision of health care. Elementary care to pregnant mothers, elementary care to newborn children, the reconstructive surgery to those who have been damaged and hurt in the war effort. All these things need to be put up, and they need to be protected from new attacks and from new destruction. And you have to realize you may have to build up the same hospital 3 times in a row, but it has to be done, because one must have hospitals if you are going to have a healthy population that is ever going to be able to change. The next thing is education. We talked yesterday in our debates about how democracy depends on the will of the people. But the will of the people cannot express itself on a logical and rational basis. If the people are fed propaganda, if they are hampered by centuries of superstition, totalitarian ideology, and various forms of intellectual and emotional terrorism from their neighbors and for those who stand in society in a way to influence them. I think the crying and screaming example of it is the status of women in a society that is fighting Muslim extremism, such as we find in the form of the Taliban. I have, as former president of Latvia, been active with a group of Latvian businesswomen. I am their patron, and they have taken on a project of bringing Afghan women businesswomen to Latvia, and to find them mentors and to find them partners and to try and see how we can provide them, in some cases, with the necessary tools or the necessary knowledge for them to be able to pick up in situations and in regions where so many of the men have been killed, that the women are left alone to try and pick up and build up a society. I met a lady who was head of a construction company whose main job was rebuilding roads after they had been destroyed by the regular placing of mines. And by the way, this is a region of Afghanistan where they have to work in burqas in 40 or 45 degree heat. I asked them how could they possibly take on such a task. And they said, with difficulty. But they do it. They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal contact with other villages, they need the roads to be rebuilt. And they build them and they rebuild them, and this is a Sisyphus task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the stone and it rolls down the next day. But this commitment, I think, is simply magnificent because it's the only way you're going to do. They take on such a task. And how could they possibly? But they do it. They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal other villages, they need, and they build them and they rebuild them, and this is a task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the Sisyphus stone and it rolls down the next day. But this commitment, I think, is simply magnificent because it's the only way the roads to be rebuilt. You're going to do. They take on such a task. And how could they possibly? But they do it. They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal other villages, they need, and they build them and they rebuild them, and this is a task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the Sisyphus said with difficulty stone and it rolls down the next day. But it's simply magnificent because it's the only way the roads to be rebuilt. You're going to do. They take on such a task. And how could they possibly? But they do it. They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal other villages. This commitment, I think, they need, and they build them and they rebuild them, and this is a task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the Sisyphus said with difficulty next day. But it's simply magnificent because it's the only way the roads to be rebuilt. They take on such a task. And how could they possibly? They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal other villages. This commitment, I think, they need, and they rebuild them, and this is a task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the Sisyphus said with difficulty next day. And they build them because it's the only way the roads to be rebuilt. They take on such a task. And how could they possibly? They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal other villages. This commitment, I think, they need, and they rebuild them, and this is a task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the Sisyphus said with difficulty next day. And they build them because it's the only way the roads to be rebuilt. They take on such a task. And how could they possibly? They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal contact other villages. This commitment, I think, is they need, and they rebuild them, and this is task. They feel like Sisyphus pulling up the Sisyphus said with difficulty next day. And they build them because it's the only way the roads to be rebuilt. They take on such a task is simply magnificent. How could they possibly? They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal contact. And other villages. This commitment, I think, they rebuild them, and this is they need task. They feel like Sisyphus said with difficulty next day. And they build them like Sisyphus pulling up the roads to be rebuilt. They take on such a task is simply magnificent. How could they possibly? They do it because simply for providing food, provides the supplies, for having normal contact. And other villages. This commitment, I think, because it's the only way they rebuild them, and this is they need task. They feel like Sisyphus said with difficulty next day. And they build them like Sisyphus pulling up the roads to be rebuilt. They take on such a task is simply magnificent. How could they possibly do it? They do it because simply for some years ago, when as a child of Latvian exiles after the communist occupation, I spent much of my life in Canada, and at one point I was vice president of the Science Council, and in that capacity was also delegated to the NATO scientific program. And it was interesting. There was an applied program and a secret one for military purposes, but there was an open one, which the sole purpose of which was to initiate more contacts between NATO member countries, so that the scientific and intellectual strength of one could be shared with those where for various historical reasons it wasn't as strong. I think this sort of aspect, for instance, on the side of NATO, in terms of working with the intellectual resources in Afghanistan, would be as impressive and produce as important results as any surge in military action and force, which I repeat, I do not condemn. I understand the strategic need for such surges on the military sense. What I am pleading for, and pleading for really desperately, is more effort, more interest in the social, psychological, intellectual growth of that country. There's so much to be done, and it can be done, and there's goodwill from all the Afghans that I have met. There's fantastic goodwill. Think of these tiny little girls going to girls' schools, knowing that the Taliban hate it, surviving attacks of having vitriol thrown in their faces and being disfigured, and still saying, I do want to be educated, I want to be to school. I find that very touching, and I think it's an extremely positive signal for the human potential of that country. But one last word. A country rests on the ability of its economic survival. The economic situation in Afghanistan needs to be addressed in a much more serious way than now. I fear that NATO, in its strategy, and I'm talking here completely unofficially, I am not an official, political official, I feel that the question of opium growing in Afghanistan has been sort of swept under the rug. It has been accepted as a lesser evil, as a necessity without which one can do. I think that worldwide, that's my own professional specialty, psychoactive drugs. I think that worldwide, drug trafficking, the sources and the harm it does to the countries providing it, such as Colombia, where I was recently, the harm that it's obviously doing to Afghanistan, and preventing its shifting over to more productive and rational incomes, is undescribable. And there are two sides to it. It's all very well to say the farmers, if they don't grow opium, they will not have anything to eat. They get such huge prices, but this feeds the Taliban lords. This feeds the insurgents. This allows them to buy the most modern arms in the world. It harms Afghanistan as a country. It harms its own people. And it does untold harm to all those countries where that opium is being exported. I would have some very controversial ideas about how it could be solved, and those include looking to the consumer countries and how you can reduce consumption of drugs in the countries that buy it. We have old-fashioned ideas about drug control and the fight against drugs that are 100 years out of date. I think a great deal needs to be changed in that. There are things like methadone, with which, for instance, you can keep an addict without pain and suffering and withdraw them from opium. Of course, addicts are not always happy about that because methadone doesn't give them the kick that they were looking for. But there are therapies, there are ways of approaching, of teaching people that drugs are not the only way to get a high, to get happy, and to get a kick out of life. So this has to start with education in the Western world as to how to be happy. We are not taught how to be happy. We get advertising, we get word of mouth. The Western world also needs to do an awful lot. And frankly, as a psychologist, what I see as a real challenge is people in the West have forgotten how to be happy without paying anything for it. It comes actually very cheap. You don't have to spend huge amounts of money. And the financial crisis has nothing to do with it. It's a matter of attitudes, a matter of opening your mind, of seeing the world with different eyes, and getting active and doing things, including good works. Ladies and gentlemen, I think, therefore, that the goodwill that we see here in this conference and that generally I have seen everywhere in the world, we should not accept that all this goodwill goes to waste and that year after year we keep getting the same news about Afghanistan. Canadians are complaining that all they're getting is just rows of coffins of their soldiers, their young men who have been killed there on the battlefield, similarly in Britain and other countries. This is a very sad situation. We see civilians being killed there. We see the Taliban making inroads in Pakistan. It need not be so. It need not remain so. It can be changed. Anything can be changed. Yes, it will need patience, but most of all, it needs true commitment, true desire to change, a flame of commitment to it, patience, and very, very hard work. To all of those who have some ideas or part in the effort, in this sort of effort, I wish you all well. Afghanistan needs it, and the world needs it as well.